Speaking of Donald Trump, he was out last night again saying Jewish voters will be to blame if he loses November's election. In an event called Fighting Anti-Semitism in America, Trump leaned heavily on anti-Semitic tropes and complained about his low support in this race among Jewish Americans.
Most popular person in Israel. But here it doesn't translate. It's a strange thing. The United States election is the most important election in the history of Israel, actually, if you think about it. How crazy does that sound? But it's true. With all I have done for Israel, I received only 24% of the Jewish vote. Now think of this. I really haven't been treated very well, but that's the story of my life. You have to defeat Kamala Harris. More than any other people on earth, Israel, I believe, has to defeat her. And it hurts me to say it. You're going to still vote for Democrats, and it doesn't make sense. I say all the time that any Jewish person that votes for her, especially now, her or the Democrat Party, should have their head examined. Jewish people that's supposed to love Israel in 2020. So remember, I got 25%. Now I did all of these things, and I got 29%. Think of it. So I wasn't treated right. I really haven't been treated right. So if I don't win this election, in my opinion, the Jewish people would have a lot to do with the loss.
He hasn't been treated right. Always the victim blaming Jews, he said, if he loses this election. By the way, that's about where he's polling among Jewish Americans at 28% or so. At the same event last night, Trump also said he would reinstitute a travel ban if he returns to the White House to prevent migrants from what he calls infested countries from entering the United States.
We will seal our border and bring back the travel ban. Remember the famous travel ban? We didn't take people from certain areas of the world because I didn't want to have people ripping down and burning our shopping centers and killing people. But we're not taking them from infested countries.
Infested countries. Let's see now. What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to say, oh, well, infested countries? That sounds like what Gerald Ford. No, Gerald Ford didn't used to say that. What Roosevelt? No. I mean, Ed, this is just straight up. I mean, is that not the language of fascist leaders? I'm just asking historically. You have that sort of language, infested countries, talking about vermin, talking about all the things that he's talked about. He and his running mate have completely, as you say in your new column, they have doubled down on ethno-nationalism, and not the sort of ethno-nationalism that's ever been prevalent, and at least not in our lifetimes, in the United States. Talk about this blood and soil campaign and where it has its origins.
Yeah, well, I think you hint very accurately at its fascist origins. In the American context, it's America First origins, which was explicitly fascist and Nazi adjacent. But let's just sort of take the irony of Trump speaking at an event last night here in D.C. that's about combating anti-Semitism and using the oldest anti-Semitic trope of all at this conference, which is, you Jewish Americans, you're all loyal to Israel. You all have dual loyalty, and therefore, because I'm pro-Israel, you don't understand your interests unless you vote for me. That is the oldest sort of anti-Semitic trope in American politics, the allegation of dual loyalty, and he goes there and makes that, and of course links it to what is at the root of almost everything Trump does and says, his own idea victimhood, his own sense of being the victim of conspiracies carried out by other people. So the irony of that is extraordinary. As regards Mark Robinson, or J.D. Vance, J.D. Vance's blood and soil nationalism, the kind of conservative movement or Republican Party we would like to see in America is what J.D. Vance used to be, which is not an ethno-nationalist. He was a libertarian, but he was a thoughtful one. We saw that in Hillbilly Elegy. He was self-questioning, thoughtful, open to debate, open to ideas. He's now gone to the other end of the spectrum, to blood and soil nationalism, because that is what Trump wants. He was quite right when he described Trump as a potential American Hitler a few years ago. Now he's signed up to this potential American Hitler, and we see all the weird, sort of morbid manifestations of a party that's chosen that route. Mark Robinson, the self-declared black Nazi, being one of them. It is exactly what you expect to happen when a party chooses the ethno-nationalist fascist route, and I don't use that word lightly.
Well, I mean, you're actually just paraphrasing what J.D. Vance warned of when Donald Trump ran for president before. He also, of course, told Christians that they should not vote. If they were Christians, they should not vote for Donald Trump. Ed, we're going to be talking next block or so about how Republicans are trying to shut down the government. Shut down the government. Mitch McConnell said it would just be complete lunacy because they don't want people from other countries to have an impact in this election. Of course, it would be illegal for people, illegal immigrants, to vote here, and they know that, so they're basically going to shut down the government to say that something that's illegal is illegal. But it's fascinating. Against that backdrop, you have Donald Trump last night in just a bizarre, rambling speech on anti-Semitism, talking about himself. But then this is one of the kickers. Israel has to defeat Kamala Harris. A foreign country has to defeat Kamala Harris. I don't even know where to begin with that.
So there were two things before this week, two external things that I was really worried could damage Kamala Harris's prospects of winning. One was a turn in the economy. That's now been, I think, ruled out. The Fed has cut interest rates by 0.5 percentage point, an overdue move that will lead to improving consumer sentiment. And I think help. It's not the reason the Fed did this, but it will help Kamala Harris's prospects. The other, which could wipe out all the benefits of that 0.5 percentage point cut, is a war in the Middle East, specifically a war between Israel and Hezbollah. However that starts, whether that's an Israeli ground operation in Lebanon, very high risk. I mean, that's a real quagmire, we know historically. Or Hezbollah itself, in retaliation for the exploding pages this week, escalating and provoking a conflict between them. That would lead to rising oil prices, rising gas prices, and hurt consumer sentiment. I have no doubt that Netanyahu wants Trump to win. Netanyahu only does things for his own self-preservation. Even allies in his own party believe that. Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, knows that Netanyahu wants to keep the war in Gaza going. Because if it ends, which the rest of the Israeli defense establishment wants it to, then Netanyahu has no place to hide. It's what's saving his political career. But I've no doubt that Trump and Netanyahu will be on the phone to each other and are acutely aware of what a wider conflict would do to Kamala Harris's prospects. That was my other concern, and it's getting more intense, that concern, with events going on there.
And again, an event ostensibly last night about anti-Semitism. Donald Trump not talking really about anti-Semitism, but in a rambling speech, as Joe said, that was just self-pity. If I don't win this election, in my opinion, the Jewish people would have a lot to do with it. U.S. national editor at the Financial Times, Ed Luce. Ed, thanks so much as always.